Reactive Training Systems.
So, Eric, your partner, Omar, called me the worst capitalist in the world. Mm-hmm. And I guess he's kind of right, because the last episode that we did with you was one of the most listened to, downloaded of our entire podcast. So we waited like 3 years to have you back. Welcome back.
Hey, one could say that you are leveraging a scarcity, perhaps. Sorry, we can only have 2 episodes of Eric Helms every 3 years. So make sure you buy the podcast now. I'm trying here. I'm trying to help you out.
I gave you little to no warning on that one, but yeah, I always enjoy having just nuts and bolts training conversations with you. And I think we've talked about this a little bit before. I think you get kind of typecast a little bit as being like the science guy. And that's obviously a strong suit of yours, but you bring a lot more to the table than just that. Every conversation I've had with you around training or pretty much any topic, you have a really balanced perspective. And specifically around training, it seems like you do understand the science side of it, but you also understand it in context. And since you're also an athlete and a coach, you understand it from an application standpoint as well. And I think that's what makes conversations with you so damn interesting.
I like the way this podcast is going.
Yeah, man.
You're saying nice things. It's great.
Well, when I started thinking about I knew I wanted to talk to you on a podcast again. And so what should we talk about? And I thought maybe the best way to get started is to just kind of ask you a bit about your training. Like, what's your training been like lately? Yeah. When the rubber meets the road for Eric Helms, what does he do?
I basically have a training program built around my insecurities right now. Yeah. So my plan is to compete in bodybuilding next year. In 2020, I got back into weightlifting. And then in 2021, I pursued powerlifting again and hit some lifetime PRs, which was pretty awesome. So for turning 40 next year, 2023, I have wanted to get back on stage, compete in bodybuilding. And a big part of that is spending 2022 in a bodybuilding off season and working on what I think are the most important weak links in my chain, if you will, for my physique development. So I've been running a specialization program where I'm doing a lot more volume on my delts, lats, and calves. The calves are just kind of almost a tack on. I don't have good calves. I don't think they'll drastically transform my physique, but I want to see, do these muscles actually grow on me anymore? So we're trying that. But yeah, so basically I start every session with a delt or a lat movement, whichever one is probably harder, depending on what I choose. So sometimes if it's an overhead press, I'll start with that. But if it's like a lateral raise, I'll do that after the lat movement. And I'm doing 4 sets, 5 on every time I train. So it's about 5 days a week. So it's about 20 sets on my shoulders and lats and calves. And then after I do those 3 movements, then I just get kind of what I perceive to be the minimum amount of work done for everything else to put on maintenance. So once a week, I do right now leg press, L's, and then I have 2 days where I do direct chest work, sprinkle in some arms, that type of thing. So it's a very bodybuilding specific focused program right now. I'm not trying to see if I can maintain some of my powerlifting strength or anything like that. I guess one laziness upside is that from bouncing around between different competitive sports, I see how quickly I can regain my strength. And I'm just not too worried about it because I went from a 170 to a 210 squat in 6 weeks from Olympic weightlifting to powerlifting. Last time I kind of switched. So I know that if I maintain my general fitness, my size, and I still have something close to the pattern, I'm not far away from being as strong as I am. Yeah, so that's why I'm kind of putting all my chips into bodybuilding, which is probably at the core my most prized out of all the Iron Game competitive desires I have. Yeah.
It's well, I don't know, man. There's a lot that I thought of to touch on with that, but I suppose kind of the specialization piece of it and possibly coming back to the powerlifts in the future. I wonder if that's kind of where a lot of the anxiety for lifters comes from, this reluctance to step further away from your comp lifts and oh no, what if my bench goes down or something like that? That it's kind of a fear of the unknown sort of situation.
100%.
If you've done it several times and you're like, oh yeah, goes away, but then it comes back and it takes about this long, then it's not so unknown anymore.
Honestly, having hip surgery in 2017 was one of the best things for me and my willingness to try this type of thing, because I am not someone who misses workouts. And being obsessive about training is what got me into this whole thing. Yeah, I can speak about it in what sounds like relatively balanced terms, but like at the core of my identity is someone who has a very strange relationship with weightlifting. So that's like someone who had to have ultimatum conversations with his wife to pursue the sports he wants to do in a healthy way if I want to stay married. Being told that maybe I should do something besides a PhD lifting weights and coaching in my life to have more balance, and repeatedly being course corrected by people around me who like spending time with me. Yeah. So for me, I think to put it in context as well. So I got bilateral FAI surgery in 2017. I probably could have benefited from the surgery. And when I first got diagnosed and wanted to get it was the end of 2013. So I tried to not get surgery for 4 years, working with physios, working around it, doing partial squats. So basically the issue that I had was that I couldn't squat the depth without causing a lot of pain in my hips and then also into my lower back. And it actually impacted me outside of the gym when I did, like having a little bit of a limp, being unable to sleep very effectively. And yeah, so ultimately what ended up happening was after 4 years of trying to work around it, I was just sitting around a 220-ish, 490-ish kind of top end squat. And before competitions, because I was still competing like an idiot, I would basically just figure out what's the fewest number of sessions I can get in where it won't harm my performance on the platform, but it'll prepare me for it. So I think like in 2016, when I competed, I probably did a total of 11 to depth low bar squats that year. And I'm including my 3 attempts on the platform there. So there was like 2 sessions during a taper, and then everything else was front squats, squats to not depth, and accessory work, trying to work around it. And I squatted 222 in that 2016 comp. And that's when I was like, all right, I need to do something about this, because my PR right before I got injured was 222. So I was like, I can hold on to the same squat forever and not be able to train the way I want and be in decently tenable pain when I do push it up. Or I can see if this, so it's, here we are. It's not going to get better. I have to do something different. So I committed, I got the surgery, and then I think it was either 4 or 5 months post-surgery, I had a high bar squat lifetime PR. And I was like, interesting, maybe, and I did high bar because I was scared to do low bar. So yeah, that experience kind of opened the mental block for me to go, okay, so strength can be regained. And these papers I've read on muscle memory and things like that, maybe they are actually real papers. And the things I've experienced as a coach for the last decade, that maybe they apply to me as well. So I think that really allowed me to start leveraging the idea of like a maintenance dose, and even allowing some DK, knowing that it can return quickly, and kind of treating strength as a skill so that you can regain it, and just thinking a little less from what's the thing that people who are like mentally healthy say, like it's not from an abundance perspective rather than a scarcity perspective. There you go. Yeah. Coming at it from that angle. And that honestly, it kind of opened the door to me being able to do the whole multi-sport strength athlete thing.
That's cool. It is one thing to, I guess, understand a concept, and then it can lots of times be something else entirely to apply it. Mm-hmm. I've heard you talk for a long time, even through that period, and I know the advice that you would have given to one of your athletes or someone else. Mm-hmm. Then, I don't know, you're self-coached for a long time, like I am. John's done self-coaching for a long time as well. And I think that's one of the tough things about that is taking your own advice sometimes.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, one of the things I was going to add there is that I think it's really neat that you had to go through the experience to really be bought in, like personally. It's like, it's one thing conceptually to understand an idea and to like back that up with data and science. It's a whole nother thing to actually live through it and to say to yourself, like, it's okay. Like I can go 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 12 weeks even without doing a power lift. And I know that reasonably I can get my strength back in this period of time. Mm. What's interesting about it is it sounds like you also have like a different relationship with the sport and a different relationship with multiple sports. And just by the sound of it, it sounds like you're just enjoying training more because you can go through these specialization cycles. You can kind of do these things and move to other different cycles. And so I wonder, like, how does it, so, bodybuilding being your main sport per se, how does the ability to cycle through all these sports now, know that you can regain strength in them and technique, like, how does that make you view powerlifting in the broader context now? Do you see that as like a more viable option, that you can do it more frequently?
That's a really good question, John. And I love the way you frame that, because I think for me, and this may be BS, but it certainly feels true, that when I can recapture that same love and feeling that I had with training when I first started, that's when I make the most progress. That's when, well, honestly, obviously inherent in just that statement, that's when I enjoy it the most. And it is difficult to recapture that feeling when progress comes slow, when you're doing something that you've done, in my case, for 18 years now. Goodness me. Adult training. Yeah. So having been training for 18 years, since 2004 is when I started, it's not that I'm someone who chases novelty. I am definitely someone who's suited towards kind of, I do my thing on a regular basis and I repeat the same movements and I don't need a whole lot of exercise variety. And I'm not someone who's like, ooh, CrossFit looks interesting. Like, it's just not my personality to need to change things a lot. But I think that's probably a continuum rather than just a switch, at least in my experience. So being able to make lateral movements to things that are going to overall still help me, even if maybe on paper they're not optimal, I think is still the best motivational strategy that I've found to recapture that feeling. So when I decide to go, you know what, I'm going to do some Olympic weightlifting, that's a really exciting process. I remember just I got in touch with my coach, Tuchscherer. I followed his program. I was doing like video coaching during lockdown. I had my nutrition in place. I was making my sleep. I was stretching regularly because I can't really do the Olympic lifts. So I was getting close to them as I could. I was getting massages regularly. I was treating myself more like a professional athlete because I was just that excited about the goal. And when I switched over to powerlifting in 2021, I also, same thing. I was like, you know what? This is going to be the year I squat 500 pounds. I'm going to do nationals. This is going to be great. Spoiler alert, nationals got canceled, lockdown, and I squatted 500 pounds in my garage, but I was still just as happy. So you can tell like how much I was bought into my goal and my training. And yeah, the same thing when I decided, let's get back on stage. As soon as I decided that and kind of made that my decision, my bodybuilding training got much more exciting. I was much more invested. I was present. I'm more focused on individual sets. I'm more confident in my RPE ratings and things like that. So the knock-on effects are significant. And as someone who's very quantitative in my thinking, I think like it's that obvious qualitatively that my training is, I'm more invested in it. So I think that has a lot of value, and I think it improves my longevity. And not only just because I think that I would probably be a guy who, like, if I decided to stop competing, like, yeah, I still train. It's not exciting. I don't really want to talk about it. It's just a thing I do because I like to wear large shirts, not mediums. And here we are. And I can tell you about back in the day, I used to bench, squat, and deadlift X, Y, and Z or whatever. But I think that kind of longevity is not the same as that when you talk to a master's athlete and they light up in the same way that they did when they were a junior lifter. I think it's helping me maintain that same level of 10-year-old happy obsessiveness with what I do, even though I'm turning 40. So yeah, I see it as a very good thing, John.
You remind me of kind of a question that's been bouncing around in my head for quite a while now. And kind of the most recent instantiation of it has been I competed like 2 weeks ago in a powerlifting competition. And
I know Bryce was there.
Yeah. We all did below expectation. But
yeah, it wasn't the happiest day for everyone, but yeah, you're qualified.
One thing I kept saying that weekend, and epiphanies always sound dumb when you say them out loud, but it was like, wow, I really like competing with my friends. It's just fun to do. And that's motivation enough maybe at the present moment. But it has been making me think more about goals and goal setting, the importance or unimportance of it. Like, I think the kind of default assumption is that setting goals and long-term goals in particular is like this really important part of the process. And I've kind of wavered back and forth on that at various times. Like, is it important that I set a SMART goal, a very specific long-term goal, maybe even put a timeline on it? It can be a really long timeline, right? Like, oh, I want to deadlift 900 time in my career. Like, is that so important? I don't think that it is. Like, I don't know that makes me do anything different in terms of my decision making or anything like that. But on the other hand, I've found in maybe other avenues and like I'm thinking about business, for example, the process of setting long-term goals and then communicating them to teammates, it does have an impact. Maybe not on specific actions that you would take, but kind of the fervor with which you might take them. And that's kind of what I hear you saying too. Like when you would change your goal, and now my stated goal is bodybuilding, that you've got more fervor when you go to the gym. So maybe it doesn't change the action, but it changes the vigor.
It becomes a focusing agent.
Yeah.
Right? Like that was one of the things I heard you say, Eric, is it's like, I started getting dialed in with my nutrition. I started focusing on like stretching and all these other things. It's like you mentally thought of yourself as a professional athlete and you treated all these other ancillary things as important in goal acquisition. And so like, Mike, in your example of business, if you're focusing on something that's close, maybe that thing was important before, but the level of importance, the urgency actually would be the right term, the urgency around the actions you take actually increase, right? And so like you can focus on that activity and you see the importance of it in a shorter time frame.
It always feels a bit arbitrary to me, though. Like we would try to be specific with these goals, like a deadlift 900 example. I have no idea if that's within the sphere of possibility or not. I have no idea if that's a good idea to set that out there. It could be too much. It could be way too easy. You're just picking something at that point. And that just doesn't, I don't know, why 900? Why not 9? Why not 1,000? It could be anything. And that seems a bit contrived.
I think you got to be careful with quantitative goals and goal setting in general. I think you need to be a little more informed about what you're doing and intentional. And this is one of those things where sometimes the sports scientists or the people who are reading sports science, they don't even think to go look at like the research on this, because there's a ton of research on like activity, motivation, sports psychology, and goal setting and attainment. And we kind of just default back to like that one personal trainer course we took in like 2006 that told us SMART goals. And we don't think about where these things came from. And I'm guilty of that as well. It's only been in maybe the last 5-6 years I've looked at some of the research on this and thought about it. And I was shocked to find out that SMART goals really came from like the corporate management world. And they have these, specific, measurable. And then I always wonder, like, why is there attainable and realistic? Like they're just kind of the same thing.
Yeah, it's very corporate, right? It's got to fit into an acronym.
Yeah, and also the reason that they actually had a different acronym when they were in the corporate world, I think the A standard for assignable. Right. So you say that to your client, you're like, oh, I meant to delegate this to who? So what? So they changed it for fitness. They were like, yeah, actionable and realistic. And they're like, those are the same thing. It's like, shut up. It's smart. Yeah. And so when you look at it, like, yeah, if you're managing a sales team, you want to be able to assign them different tasks and different goals. And people are trying to reach quantitative numbers and we have to sell this much. We got a bottom line. We got to grind everybody sold down to the bone so we can make the sales, and the machine goes on. Long live sales. So that is kind of
picture.
Yeah, it's great. We're selling. So like that's where that came from. And I think applying it to people, sometimes it forces people to, it doesn't force them to. I think it doesn't necessarily encourage process-oriented goals. It encourages very outcome-heavy goals. And there are issues with that. I think a very common thing that we see in powerlifters is because it's kind of this gym-based kind of sport that's not an Olympic sport, it's not a professional sport. You typically can't do it in university. There are exceptions to that, of course, or whatever. So you end up being some dude or some gal who lifts, and then you find out from someone else, oh, I can compete in this. Sick. And then you love it. It's great. And then all of a sudden you start finding yourself lifting to compete rather than lifting. And I found out that I could compete, and this is a nice little cherry on top and a way to further motivate myself. And I've seen people who lifted for years get into powerlifting, quit powerlifting and quit lifting. And I'm always kind of wondering, what the hell is going on there? And there's actually research on this, like going on all the way back. And I won't belabor this study because I think I've described it on almost every podcast I've been on where mindsets come up in the last decade. But it was this really interesting study done way back in the day that wouldn't get ethics approval now with like preschoolers or kindergartners, I can't remember. And they went in and they found for their free time, these kids are drawing, right? So they kind of split these kids up into 3 groups. One, they just watched how much they drew before and then during and after the study period. Another group, they gave a reward after the study period, which was just day to day for these kids based upon who drew the most. And then another group, they said, hey, guess what? We're enrolling you in a drawing contest. And whoever draws the most gets this sticker or star or something that motivates the children. And at the end of it, they come in and they award these things. Then they track how much do they keep drawing afterwards. And in the group that was not told they were in a competition but given a reward, they kept drawing the same amount. In the quote unquote control group, they kept drawing the same amount because they didn't even know they were in the study. But the group that said, hey, guess what? You're now in a drawing contest. Once the period is over, they reduced the amount of drawing they did because they had the hypothesis that they had supplanted whatever their own drive was prior to draw with I'm drawing to get the sticker or the medal or the reward or the kindergartner art contract, I can only assume, to get these kids working early and then get them on SMART goals, right?
Get them selling.
Yeah, somebody's got to start selling these little kids' drawings. So I think that happens in sport. And I think one of the reasons it happens is because you start supplanting the love of the process with the desire to achieve a specific outcome. So I think you can do harm with some of these goals, like you were saying, Mike, like a random desired deadlift 900 or whatever. And it's not to say that you can't have specific quantitative outcome goals. I just think they need to kind of be in a hierarchy. And at the core, probably you want some kind of identity related thing like, hey, my goal is to be a strong person or a healthy person or a power lifter or like whatever that might look like, that is not attached to a success at a given number, but it's attached to a lifestyle and a who and a why. And then from there, that might be your, in goal parlance, your superordinate goal. And then from there, you have these intermediate goals that are bigger picture, and they're focused on, I want to have a good career or I want to train regularly. You can make them these things that set you up for success rather than potentially setting up you for failure. And then underneath those intermediate goals, then you have your subordinate goals, which can still and probably should in most cases be process oriented. I want to train X number of times per week. I'm going to write my program. I'm going to hit these macros, et cetera, et cetera. But you can also have, and I would like to, at the end of this block, add 15 pounds to my squat. And when that is low on that goal hierarchy, it's not as big of a deal. It's like, okay, well, I'm still a power lifter. I'm still got my core identity. I'm still training regularly. I'm doing all the things that make me feel like I'm accruing all these wins. But I fell a little short of my goal, and I can assess that from a healthy mental spot and do things differently. And that's the way you do it. Or you run the risk of feeling like you had lost something like your identity or a higher order goal when you fall short of something that might have not even been a realistic thing to set in the first place, to your point.
Yeah. The exact number that you hit's not really within your control anyway. Right. The process stuff, yeah. But you could do everything right. And it's not really up to you whether that results in a 10-pound gain or a 15-pound gain or whatever. But let's continue this psychological dissection of me. That'd be great. When I went into this last competition, I did, as we're stating here, like I had my main goal that was more process oriented. I borrowed some language from Newton Chang, one of the guys who's worked with us for years, and I stated that I wanted to maximize my potential on the day. I wanted to represent myself, represent my training well, and that's the ultimate goal. Below that, there are these numeric goals, right? The thing is, it's one thing to write that on the paper, and it's something else to actually believe it. That's kind of, I don't want to make it sound like I had like some sort of crisis after a slightly subpar competition or anything, but it wasn't the kind of positive experience that I had back in March after the first competition that was a much different setting and scenario, right? But I kind of, in reflecting, it's like, yeah, I said that was the ultimate goal, but I didn't act like that was the ultimate goal. When it came down to actually doing actions that are related to these, I chose numbers first. And that led to some outcomes that were not as good. And yeah, you feel some kind of way about that. Yeah, I don't really know what to do or say about that. Like how, I don't know how I would, for instance, guide one of my athletes in a scenario on that, other than to point out that's a thing that can happen. Like, hey, look, we're saying that this is the ultimate goal. Make sure that you actually believe that and understand what that means. I don't know if that's sufficient, you know?
Do you think that it has something to do with relatedness to a certain extent? Like, so when we think about like social determination theory and like motivation, autonomy, competence, and relatedness, when you think about the relatedness piece, how much of the numbers game is like us looking and comparing at our competition, placings at your level, Mike, competing with other people for potentially a world team slot? Like, how much of it is the relatedness of like, if I don't hit these things, I'm not at this level. And how does that relate me to other people?
Yeah.
It's like, that's the thing that I wonder is, because we know autonomy, right? Like in competence, you're self-coached, you're incredibly competent. And then there's the relatedness piece that I think is an influence. And I think just even saying that it's an influence is important. Like to say that it could influence decision making. Like, I want to go for these numbers because it elevates the game. It elevates everybody else in my competition. It elevates me and where my status is, right? So I think it's an important thing. I just had a conversation with an athlete about this and was saying, like, be aware of it. And it's okay to be thinking about status. It's okay to be thinking about, are you the top 10 in a 105? Like that's okay, but don't let it be the only deciding factor in your decision-making and in longevity.
Well, I think it's, again, I come back to this notion that it's one thing to say it, and then how do we put that into practice? I've talked several times before about my experience through like the 2014 World Championship, and that I lifted well but didn't win. And my stated goal prior to that competition was really focused on winning. And I lifted well, didn't win. And I remember feeling kind of weird about that. And like, well, I don't know if I'm happy or not happy. It's kind of this weird mix. And talking to Susie Hartwood-Gary about that. And that was a pretty big pivotal moment for me, and kind of refocusing goals on like, okay, what's kind of within my sphere of control and what's not. So naturally, after this competition, I get back on the phone with Susie. So I had a long chat with her, actually just yesterday. It was kind of around this. And I mean, I don't want to present this like it's her advice, because I think it was a long conversation as her advice is nuanced. But one of the takeaways that I took from it is like, what can I put into action to make sure that any goal that I set is at its proper place? How can I make sure that it's not, yeah, you're saying that this is a goal, but really you're putting all your eggs in this one basket? And I think for me, there were some small tweaks that I could make to my attempt card, for example, to highlight that, hey, there's actually a range of outcomes that, and we would be, yeah, this is the top end, and that would be really outstanding. But then this is kind of the mid-range, and that's pretty good too. We don't need to all of a sudden feel bad about that. And then realistically, what are the possibilities here? Like, yeah, there's this number goal, but then when you look at it, you're like, oh man, that total is going to require that I hit every plan A on the card. And I know from like just historically speaking, I'm usually not quite there. I'm usually like a little 2.5, 5 or so kilos below that, or somewhere in that range. Okay, so maybe like setting, like really emphasizing this very top end goal is not the healthiest thing. And I think maybe some systems changes like that can help, at least help me put things in a little bit better perspective. Yeah.
I think there's another way to look at it too, is you don't necessarily have to prevent. I think if you can, and what will prevent this disconnect between your stated goals and the way you want to see yourself really, and how you feel afterwards. And things are like, oh, that lower tier goal kind of just took my whole mental space. What's up with that? I think it's a diagnostic. I had a similar experience in 2019 when I was competing in my last bodybuilding season. One of my goals, which wasn't the top goal, at least I said so, was to get my pro card in WNBF and compete as a pro. And in the first pro qualifier I did in late July, I had a really tight battle in the middleweights, light heavyweights, I can't remember. And I placed second. And I was mad. And I was thinking about like, do I agree with judges? How do I feel? And it impacted how I was carrying myself, what I was thinking on, my focus, my emotional state, ultimately more than I wanted it to, given the context that it was the best I'd ever looked. And like anytime someone's like, hey, can I get a picture for this whatever? I'm like, oh, let me go to that competition because that looks fucking sick. Yeah, like I have a hung picture that someone drew of me in that competition. So it was my best peak, the best I've ever looked. I think it, if anything, it like over-represents what my physique looks like. The peak was that good. But that's like, I wasn't carrying myself like that. I was heavily impacted by the fact that I didn't win. So for me, that was like, well, okay, are you actually Mr. Enlightened? I just want to do this for self-progression and it's me versus me, or is that just some shit you want to believe about yourself? And I think to some degree I had to accept that, well, maybe I'm more focused on winning and getting a pro card, and that's a big deal to me, and I'm more competitive than I've been trying to suppress my competitiveness to some degree, because I think that's a healthy thing to do. I think that's I like logically, philosophically, I think I only have so much power over that. It's giving up power, especially in a sport like bodybuilding. It's not like I know what your numbers are going to the comp. I know what my potential is. I can at least play the odds. It's far more subjective. So I think for me, it was a moment for me to reflect and go, all right, well, is this okay? And is me being a little more competitive minded, is that a big deal? And am I actually maybe doing some things, I'm taking this too far. I'm not accepting some of my elements of my personality and my goals, and that could be hurting my motivation. Maybe I get a little excited about winning. Do I actually think that if I focus even more on winning, or if I kind of let the shark into the water, that it's going to have an overall negative impact? Or can I just be sad a little bit and angry and frustrated and throw my tantrum and then get back to being who I am? I'm a big boy, right? And that's basically what I came to, was that, yeah, I was kind of a D-bag for like 12 hours and mostly I internalized it, so it didn't really negatively affect anybody. So perhaps it's okay to focus on winning, so long as I can control my tantrums. And it doesn't, if I don't think it's a threat to my bigger picture stuff. So sure, get invested in winning, so long as it's realistic, it's done in a healthy way, etc., terms and conditions, all that good stuff. And, but yeah, and I think, like you said, John, speaking to maybe why is also valuable, because that could potentially change the flavor of that. Is it about social comparisons? Is it about something else? And I think it's probably a relatively rich explanation as to why something means so much. So exploring that probably can only benefit you and give you more agency. But I think it is, at the very least, those moments are diagnostics of going, right, I wrote all the shit down. I had my vision board, I had my goals, and something low ended up being very high, or the thing that was high didn't quite get me juiced. So maybe I need to see if I can explore these things and reorient them to be better aligned with what I actually care about.
It's the tough thing about goal setting, I think, is it's as much a process of self-discovery as it is something that you have executive control over. You know?
Well said.
What I was just going to add to that in terms of goal setting too, like you could be surprised by situations. So I did my first equip meet in 2020 only as an opportunity to learn more about putting the equipment on and feel what it's like, because you don't know unless you do it. And you could coach it, you could conceptually understand it, but you don't really know until you do it. And I remember falling in love with it and saying, this is a lot of fun. And what's interesting is I enjoyed certain aspects of that versus raw lifting. It's not that I didn't enjoy raw lifting. It's not that I don't want to do raw lifting. It's just that the equip lifting provided a whole nother scenario of challenges. And what's interesting about that is it changed my goals. And I wonder too, if when we try for certain things, we try for certain goals and we're not successful in the way that we want, when we look at like outcome orientation and we shift our logic, just like in a training block, we try an idea, we have a concept, we do this thing, and it doesn't come out the way we want it to. That's a learning experience. It's an opportunity to refocus us on other things, to say, oh, okay, well, I ventured into this direction. It didn't really work the way I wanted it to. Now let's head back in this direction. I wonder if, like, even looking, like you mentioned, attempt selection. Can you create different processes around attempt selection? Can you create different processes around the training leading into the meet, the taper? That's where what's neat about it is this continual learning, right? This lifelong learning perspective. And that's one of the things that I've tried to look at is equip lifting for me became another lifelong learning opportunity. It became this other thing that I got to learn from, and it's motivational. And even if I only do it once every 2 years or once a year or however often I do it, it still becomes another thing that I can learn. And when I'm feeling a little burned out from raw lifting, I can do that. And I kind of heard that from you, Eric, like, hey, I could do this weightlifting thing. I could do this powerlifting thing, and I could do the bodybuilding thing. And the other thing that I think is really interesting is it also questions your concept of specificity a bit, right? Like we often think that it's like, if it is not a high bar or low bar, it doesn't count, right? Like we could really think that it's that far in that continuum. And it's so interesting that you can take 6 weeks and get back to right around your training maxes before. So it challenges some of these fitness concepts, these things, these theories that we have about fitness. And I think we can learn a lot from challenging those situations that we've been in. We can learn a lot by kind of throwing ourselves into a domain that's uncomfortable and maybe not having success with it.
Totally agree. I think, the specificity conversation is always a fun one, because I think most people, when they identify themselves as being more or less specific, that almost kind of tells you a little hint about their concept of it, that they see it in more dichotomous terms than it really operates in, and that there are rules of specificity rather than it being kind of a guiding principle and a way to see things. So I think when you start asking questions about, well, how much specificity do you need? And does specificity apply outside of biomechanics or to load? To pick on our good friend Mike Zerdos from 10 years ago unfairly without him here, so you think that he still has the same ideas from 2013, which he absolutely doesn't, but it's fun to make fun of him. I remember giving him shit about putting his belt on during his 20 kilo bar warm-ups on squats. And he was like, it's more specific. And I'm like, it's 20 kilos. You squat 220 kilos. It's literally less than 10% of what you lift. It's not specific. There's nothing you could do to make a barbell squat, and just the barbell to your 1RM from that paradigm. So I just found that funny, because he would also be like, oh, and by the way, your pause squat doesn't count towards your squat at that time. And this is 100%, just to clarify, not how Zerdos thinks anymore. But at the time, I was just like, this constructed set of rules is not actually how things necessarily work. And you could make an argument that a belted up 70% of 1RM single with commands is less specific than a 1RM box squat to depth, because I don't know which one actually is more specific, and it probably differs for each individual. But the point is that there's load specificity, there's biomechanical specificity, there's environmental specificity, and which ones do you need right now? Where are you at in your career? How deeply grooved are your motor patterns? So for someone who has a similar amount of muscle mass in all the areas, can produce force, and then just kind of needs to like re-up on their skills, take a quick refresher course. 6 weeks of me doing singles 2 to 4 times a week was enough for me to get back to 99% of my old strength. Might not be true for somebody else. But looking for a blanket application of specificity, you're already wrong in many cases.
Yeah. I think people tend to see it as like this, like a 2-dimensional continuum where you're either left or right. And to be fair, I've been guilty of presenting it that way in presentations and whatnot. But I think that's maybe fine for a day one introduction to the concept. But like, I think of it more now as more like a radar plot. Like you could look at it from like a pretty significant number of different parameters. Like it could be specific from the perspective of one muscle versus another, or like you mentioned, a motor pattern versus maybe a slightly different motor pattern, and maybe even joint actions and certain things. But
it also gets me thinking about our conversation about goal setting. I mean, we were talking about like process versus like outcome orientation with our goals. We probably operate on a continuum there too, right? Like you're kind of talking about that before, Eric, with Mike, like, hey, there's nothing wrong with having numbers in your mind. Like that's part of being competitive. Yeah. That's part of being like a competitive athlete and being hungry. And if we suppress that and we say, hey, that doesn't exist, that's not fair, because it does. And you talk to any person who's been really competitive in the sport and they all have it, right? Mm-hmm. Like, so that there's an important factor there. It's just, it can't take up so much of your focus that you end up making decisions that you otherwise wouldn't, right? Or there may be a situation that happens to you in which then challenges your ability to execute in the way you want to. Let's say in the case of injury, if you're so outcome focused and you can't train the way you normally do, that can really challenge your motivation. So it's like, there has to be more.
100%. I think it comes down to not removing your ability to make decisions, or not forcing you into doing things, just like basically making yourself less adaptable. I think that's what I see the most. Is you see it in almost all sports, is that the typical athletic mindset is when things don't go well to type more tightly control my environment. I'm going to eschew eating out. I'm not going to train my workout partners. I need to go to this specific gym with this specific equipment. I need the Alico stuff. I need X, Y, and Z. I'm going to make sure I video all my sets so my RPE is more accurate. It's to kind of tighten the cranks. And I think that narrows your focus, which is a double-edged sword. It allows you to really hone in on, I have control over these variables. That's empowering, et cetera, X, Y, Z. But it also kind of puts you in a risky position because life is inherently out of your control to some degree. So when you get injured, when you get sick, when the competition date changes, when you have this weird niggle that you need to train around, or you travel, or you have 5,000 kids like Mike, whatever is happening, then when you try to maintain the sense of control that is actually, you just don't have it right now. You can't do these things, or it comes at great cost. Something else is sacrificed that because you have a narrow focus, it's not in there, like mental health or sleep or something like that. Whatever for your individual perspective on what do you tighten your control down on, it's not there. Work-life balance, what have you. I see this all the time, and I think it's more pronounced in bodybuilding just because some of the personalities involved and that there's more things you would ideally control to get the best out of you, is that you can have this like decay around everything that isn't being focused on by the athlete, and eventually that creeps in, and ironically it harms the performance. So that is often my sneaky foot in the door to get an athlete to broaden their perspective and become more resilient instead of trying to clamp down on what they're controlling. Is this actually might harm your performance. I'm actually thinking about, is you're going to get divorced and lose your job, and you're going to be unhappy and depressed, and this isn't going to be good human decision makings. But the only way I can talk to them when they're in that tight of a performance focused mindset is through performance. And it is also true that if you get divorced and lose your job and are depressed, it might affect your performance. So that's how I get my foot in the door. And then once I can get that reins to get a little looser, and then we go, okay, well, now I'm going to try to reduce the number of constraints I'm putting myself under. And how do I be optimal within that context? It ends up by default being, I become more adaptable. I learn how to track my food at a restaurant, or I learn how to eyeball, or I learn which changes to make to my program when I'm in a gym that is away from home. I know what to do when I feel X, Y, and Z in the gym. I know what to do if my RPE skyrockets with low weights. I have these options. I have like, if not A, then B or C or D. And when previously it was A or nothing because I have to be specific or I have to get these goals or what have you. And I think that is a really, really important step that is like continues throughout an athletic career. And I think athletes can do things, or coaches can do things to purposely build that. So in 2019, just as an example, and this isn't like, aren't I amazing? Just as an example, I decided I was going to keep doing conferences and seminars, and my work would stay exactly the same. My travel schedule would stay the same, despite the fact that I was competing in bodybuilding and getting shredded and all this stuff. And yeah, I went over my time slot at UEBC, and yes, I might have been half awake while watching the European Powerlifting Conference presentations in London when I flew across the world 2 weekends back to back. But I was okay from an emotional perspective. And any impacts it had on my performance, they were my choice. So they didn't bother me as much. I was like, okay, well, I know the limits of me deciding to travel around and do these things, rather than it just kind of being everything outside of this tiny little circle is fear, which I think further engenders poor decision making. So anyway, that was a bit of a tangent and a soapbox moment, but I think it's really important to kind of look at those two different things. Is there's resilience and adaptability, and then there is tightening the reins. And there's a time and a place for both, but there's costs to both as well. But the costs related to being more resilient and adaptable is you go, oh, okay, maybe I need to do less, but it's not scary. But when it's outside of your control, that stuff is scary, and it does harm decision making quite a deal, quite a lot.
I know we're kind of running a little short on time, but I wanted to take us back to the conversation of your training, specifically like the specialization work that you're doing. Sorry, computer did a weird thing. So specifically like the specialization stuff that you're doing, seems like you're using the increased training frequency as a vehicle to get lots of volume in. I'm wondering, I know that's kind of might even say a standard way to look at training frequency at this point as a vehicle for volume manipulation. Do you see any benefits or effects of training frequency? Do you apply any further consideration to training frequency beyond just the vehicle for volume, either for yourself or for clients?
Yeah, I think in different contexts, frequency can, in and of itself, be something helpful. And there are echoes of that in some of the literature. I would say that, yeah, that is probably a pretty accurate description that you just provided, that frequency is largely a volume allocation tool. And I think this is relatively intuitive when you think about, okay, I need to do a high volume of training. I'm going to do 20 sets on squats or 20 sets for quads. And that's not crazy high volume, but it's reasonably high. If I told you, yeah, do it all in the same session or split it up between 2 or 3, you'd immediately be like, well, that'd be dumb to put it all in one session. And that's not that well shown in the research, but I don't think it's not true. I think it's just because there's not a lot of studies on people doing 20 sets of quads or 20 sets of squats. But the data we do have, which is relatively limited in the most recent meta-analyses, find exactly that is largely outcomes are based on volume. And when you control for volume at match frequency, you get similar outcomes. There are little hints of different things, though. I think there's one meta-analysis which found, like, for bench press, higher frequencies might have an independent positive effect. And there's also some studies which, depending on how you look at volume, suggest that maybe it can allow a little more. For example, there was a recent study that just came out by Neves and colleagues that was specifically like this within subject design, where they had these 2 different ways of doing different frequency training. One was matched volume and one was not. So they had different frequencies. And in one of these comparisons, they allowed people to just go to failure and do as many reps as they could with a given load, if I recall correctly. I might be slightly misstating the study, but the ultimate outcome was that you had a volume matched frequency difference group, and then you had one group where they kind of opened it up for the higher frequency group to be able to do more, not sets, but volume load. And there was slightly, it wasn't a huge difference, but there was some slight inclinations of, oh, things might have been better for that non-volume matched group. Because one thing is, when you clamp volume but manipulate frequency, you might be removing one of the potential benefits of manipulating frequency, that if you're more fresh, you could potentially get more volume. So it's kind of, how do you look at volume? Is volume something prescribed, or is volume an outcome of the way you set up your training? And that depends on the RPE, the training style, all that good stuff. But there are implications of that, even if you have a training style which doesn't allow frequency to result in more volume, meaning that you're fresh enough that you could do more volume. And does that have benefits? And for me, I would say I have found subjectively, yes. The unique Helms diagram of things that result in what do I think is the best training for me are such that I have a relatively easy way of growing my legs. They seem to respond pretty well to low, moderate, or high volumes. And high volumes just hurt more and take more time, but don't seem to accelerate my strength and gains or necessarily result in noticeably different sizes in my circumferences or visual differences. And I think, like most people, I'm pretty similar in that, man, if I had to do a hard 4 to 5 sets of squats or deadlifts or leg press or hack squats, there is a hit to my motivation levels. I'm huffing and puffing, even if I'm in decently good shape. And there is going to be either a higher level of effort to maintain the same amount of work for the rest of the workout, or it will drop off a little bit. So if I only need 6 to 8 sets for each muscle group in my lower body, maybe as much as 10 or 12, why don't I try splitting that up? Because I need a lot more volume for my upper body. So that's something I've discovered in the last 5, 6, 7 years, honestly, almost 10 now, is I need to do about twice the amount of volume on my upper body to my lower body to have a more proportional physique, to get things moving. And that's true for strength as well. Like, unfortunately, the difference between me benching 140, 150, and 160 is like these hugely diminishing return drop changes in volume. I can bench once a week and I can maintain 140. I can bench 2 or 3 times a week and I can hang around 150. But if I want to improve on 150 and maintain a bench that is close to the best I've done thus far, every time I train, I bench. So I have to do other stuff like that like I've tried some overloading techniques and things that seem to have worked. Anyway, that aside, what that results in is that for me, why don't I just do one hard leg movement per day max and then spread it out? And I find that my overall session quality goes up. It improves my upper body training. And I don't think that was a perspective that I would have had if I kind of just maintained that traditional view of what frequency is for. So yeah, that is a part of the specialization approach. That same concept then applied to like my delts and my lats that I'm trying to specialize on, is I put them first in the workout. So even if I got to do leg press or RDL, I might start with a lateral raise, which looks weird, and NSCA is unhappy about that. But it is what it is, because
this is some old school bodybuilding stuff going on right now.
But there actually is research showing that you can get some better outcomes on the first exercise in the session. You're fresher.
It's just like this mental image of a bunch of like old coachy types sitting around like a long table in a dark room, like being upset than Eric is doing. What are we going to do about these lateral raises?
We got to talk about Helms' lateral raises before he squats. NSCA convention confirmed. Should we take away a CSCS? I think we have to. Yeah. So yeah, that's kind of the approach I'm taking, is I'm leveraging exercise order and I'm leveraging frequency, and I'm doing other things. I'm also thinking about which exercise train me to long muscle length and where am I going to failure, and then kind of making sure those don't happen on back-to-back days. I train 5 days a week, so I've got a few number of slots where I can move things around, where I have an off day the next day. Yeah.
This has been something I've been dabbling with a bit more lately as well. So if you consider whatever volume landmark you're targeting for a given block, you can probably reach that with a variety of different frequencies. But that volume landmark is going to dictate the frequencies a bit, right? So if you needed to do 20 sets, then you're not cramming that all into one session. You're going to lose effectiveness at some point, and you've got to distribute that out. But there's probably a range of acceptable frequencies that you could use. I've been playing around a bit more with just varying that. And I find that lots of powerlifters, at least, don't love that. We have our schedule, and I squat every Monday, and squats on Monday, please. Not squats on other days. Monday's squat day. I like to mess around with stuff like that sometimes. And I wonder, it does make the experience of training quite a bit different. I tend to think that there's got to be something physiologically different about that, like the adaptations gained from doing one set. Or like we've had some strategies that we've employed before where we'll take like the comp lift, and you have your given volume of comp work, and you just distribute it out through every session. So every session basically starts with an SBD, but it's fairly light and very low volume, so you get through it fairly quickly, and you have the rest of the session to do other stuff, right? So that would be one approach. But then there are more approaches that are fairly typical powerlifting approaches, where you have your comp squat day and other things. I can't help but think that the adaptations have to be different for those different conditions, just because the experience of doing it is so different. It kind of wouldn't make sense for the adaptation to be completely the same. Now, whether it's significantly different or meaningfully different or different in a way that you care about is a different question entirely. But I think that's at least a start. Like, it can't be exactly the same, right?
No, it's similar on things we care about. Is the way I see it is, if, okay, let's say you got 18 sets of squats you're trying to get through in a week, and you do them on 2 days, because you don't squat more than twice a week according to old school powerlifting, right? So you've got some pretty brutal squat days. Those days you think about in advance. You're like, the whole day you're a little scared. You go into those sessions. There's a halfway point when you've done 4 or 5 sets and you still got 3 to 5 sets left, where you have to kind of have the little internal rocky monologue, and it's a game of inches or whatever nonsense. You change the music. You eventually get through it. You're a sweaty mess. You actually have to think about the length of the session, maybe what food you ate, both from a perspective, I don't want to yak, but I also need to make sure that I have sufficient energy for this. All that goes away when you then change that to, instead of doing 18 sets in 2 workouts, to 18 sets in 4 workouts. You don't have any days that you need to do a lot of those things. And I think from an adaptation perspective, yeah, there's probably there's the whole neurological side of that is probably doing something. But also from an energetic standpoint, yeah, you're not going to have any given session that is going to really create this massive energy sink. So yeah, you might get some meaningfully different, like cardiovascular adaptations or energy system adaptations. But yeah, that probably doesn't matter for most powerlifters. It may in some cases. But I think ultimately for powerlifting, the way I see it is, you want to get the high load exposures. You want to get the meaningful practice. You want to be having most of your sets be done with your ability to focus on it rather than get through it. You need to get depending on your phase of training, the requisite volume in to hopefully have the morphological adaptations to support it. And ultimately, it just comes down to what's the best way to schedule all this so that we can kind of keep as many of those multiple bars as high as we can at the same time. Yeah, and something that I do with a lot of my lifters is kind of my default initial setup is I'm going to start you with these singles at 1 to 3 or 4 days per week on the big three based upon which lifts require the most out of you, which lifts are behind others, which ones are more painful for you, and how far are we out from competition? How much accessory work do we need to do? Where are you at in your career? Do you have the kind of the foundation of size that I think would probably be supporting your strength? And then I periodize those singles, and then it's just kind of the accessory work that changes and fluctuates as well along with it in kind of an inverse proportionality. But then there's the individualization process on top of that. But it's a similar concept to physique work and specialization. And I think it's also, to give a big shout out to the way you guys operate, it gives you this constant benchmark of where you're at on the powerlifting side. These singles, you can bootstrap kind of your assessment too. So I love it.
Yeah. I like to vary it, or especially lately, I've been modulating the frequencies more often. And whether or not there's a physiological adaptation that we care about that's different from those, I think there could be. That it seems to me like within the sphere of possibility that it could be something useful and maybe something that's not fully understood or fully expected. But it also creates a different experience, and I might look at it that way as well. That I feel like, especially as I've gone through a lot of the thinking behind the emerging strategy stuff, where we'll kind of start from a phenomenological standpoint. You make this observation that this is what we see happen, and then try to figure out a means of explaining it based on what we know. I feel like I've reached more and more for psychological explanations or motivational explanations for some of these things, like maybe a different conversation, but the whole concept of time to peak at this point, I think, is probably more psychological than physiological, although there certainly could be an interplay of both. But I wonder if it's not something similar from a frequency standpoint that, having those periods where, you've got this brutal squat day, and you're going to have to plan in advance and do all the things for it. It's got your attention. Do you want to grind like that forever? Probably not. That there needs to be phases of, if you're going to do that, there's got to be phases of it. And of course, then the lens of applying it to individuals, that it's got to be right person, right situation. Certainly that's contraindicated at sometimes. But
I like that perspective. And I think the way I look at it is this facilitative or debilitative right now?
Yeah.
And with right now being a key thing. And I think for a large part of my career as an athlete, and I think for a large part of, and sometimes forever, like they never actually change this for many athletes, is you feel like it needs to be hard because it's supposed to be. And there's this almost fear of it not being as hard as possible, or a certain level of hardness or difficulty. I mean, the parallel here, just to give an idea of kind of what I'm talking about, when I started moving away from the more kind of rigid approaches to bodybuilding contest prep, and it gets easier, fearful reaction was, is something wrong? Am I doing prep wrong? And I'm like, that's a very strange thing to think, Eric. Like, you're losing weight, you're looking better, performance is good. Those are your indicators of something, whether something is wrong or not right. But emotionally, I'm like, is that the indicator? Or am I just supposed to feel like shit because that's what I'm used to, and that's the way it's supposed to be when I talk to bodybuilders? So I think for powerlifting,
you end up with these cultural reference points, right?
Exactly. And they exist for powerlifting as well. Like, I'm supposed to have the 5x5 hard ass leg day. I'm supposed to be able to talk about deadlifts and bench press and squats in these ways. It's relatedness to what you were saying earlier, John. And it's also, you're much more comfortable when you're going on a journey towards competition or training or whatever, when you have an idea of what the map in front of you is supposed to look like. That's the reason, one of the main reasons people hire coaches. I've never done this before. You have, can you normalize this experience so it's not as scary while I do it? And I think when I started to let go of the idea that it is supposed to be hard or supposed to be easy or supposed to be whatever, and I just thought about what's facilitative or debilitative, my decision-making changed. Because sometimes I thought, like, what I really need is a fucking hard-ass squat session. Like, I'm in a good mental place for that. Doing it will make me feel accomplished, and it'll motivate the rest of my training moving forward. But other times, and I think planned a hard-ass squat session, I'm like, God, it's the last thing I want to do right now. Like, can I do leg extensions? Like, maybe I could do BFR leg extensions. I just want the lowest load possible on my body that's effective, because I'm so tired of getting crushed by 90% of 1RM squat singles or something like that. And I think about, well, what's facilitative? Like, I need to recover emotionally from the training I've done to myself so that the rest of my training is effective. I need a breather here, but I still need to be effective. And I think when I come at it from that angle, my blocks get programmed knowing that I have a broad range of what could be effective. Now, certain concessions I won't make based upon timelines, competitions, goals, etc. But when I can make concessions, that's what I lean towards, is what is going to be most facilitative? Or will this beat me down and make subsequent training harder, worse, recovery poorer, and me not enjoy things? So I think that is what I modulate that based upon, because I do think there's benefits to modulating it.
Well, there's a lot of, I think this is also what you were saying, that there's a lot of experience and context that goes into making that kind of decision. And it's easy to be swayed by, this is something that drives a lot of my own system creation, is that it's easy for me to be swayed by my own feelings of the moment. And I feel like at this point too, I could kind of argue for pretty much anything. So if I just want a leg extension day, I could make a justified sounding argument for it. So I want a system that hopefully exists outside of me that can give some sort of reference to that. Maybe I think for most people, that's just a coach, but it's just that I'm so stubborn about being self-coached that I am creating a spreadsheet that's filling that role for me. There's nothing psychologically deficient there.
Not at all.
And to be honest, it's hard to ask yourself the question, even if you're experienced, is this facilitative or debilitative? Like, I'm sitting back and I'm thinking about that as a heuristic, Eric. First off, I really like that. And second, I think, like, how would you in some way create a system that would help you to be a bit more objective with that? Because personality matters a lot, right? Yep. Like, you can have an athlete who's a bit timid, right? They're a bit timid to kind of put more load on the bar. And it's like, when faced with the decision to add or load or stay with the same, they may stay with the same, right? So a person like that, from a personality standpoint, would benefit from a coach like encouraging, or training partners encouraging, right? So like, just even asking that question, what do you think is facilitative versus debilitative? They don't know, right? At least if you're sitting back judging it, one would think you could add load to the bar, it'll be okay. You have another person, and we've all worked with this, is the constant overshooter, the constant, I'm going to add another 5. Like, that type of individual who probably ought to stop and actually would do better doing some leg extensions or leg press or something, right? Like, they would probably be better off suited to doing that and allowing more recovery. It's actually quite hard. And I like Mike's thought on this of like creating guardrails. Like, how can you create a system that has this heuristic to say, hey, if these things show that this is happening, if your fatigue is at this point, or your warm-ups, Mike, I know you love bar velocity, is like, hey, my bar velocity on my warm-ups are like this, or hey, my benchmark today, whether that's a single or not, is showing that it's around here. I ought to probably do this work. That to me is like the benefit of autoregulation, because it isn't logical to assume that your recovery is going to be the same all the time, or that in your entire training career, you can do 6 to 8 hard squats every session you come in. Like, there's periods of time where, like Mike has a gazillion kids, I have a gazillion kids. You just can't do that amount of work like you used to do 10 years ago. Like, I think the point is, like, we have to have a system that helps us to kind of navigate the right decision. And there is value probably in having training partners and having a coach, or having like a system that Mike's created that like helps you to make that decision.
Yeah, 100% there is. And it's easier for bodybuilding. Like, that whole facilitative, debilitative decision-making process, it's like, instead of having a squat pattern slot, you have quads, and that's a single leg press, that's a sissy squat, that could be BFR. Also, for most people, and there are some individual differences, but it's hard to tell, a set of 6 and a set of 20 both roughly do the same thing, or they don't, but they do for the adaptation we care about. So you have far more options, and you can make it feel like, depending on how much discomfort you want and how hard you want to push, etc., you can stop a little short of failure, do another set. I think you can, if you kind of understand what's going on nuts and bolts wise from the stimulus, and you have a decent idea of your individual needs. Those are some huge caveats, by the way, that I just dropped in there casually. And then I think for bodybuilding, like from exercise selection and rep range perspectives, you can make some decisions that can meaningfully change the experience, but probably won't meaningfully change the adaptation. I think when it comes to maximizing squat, bench, and deadlift performance, all of a sudden that was the noise of shrinking, if you couldn't tell. It narrows the number of things you can select from. And then if you get closer to competition, like, all right, it's squat day, I'm 4 weeks out, I should probably fucking squat. So I think you do have to start with, all right, here is a system, and here's the limits of how far we can deviate from the norm. And you can create systems where that day where you feel like shit becomes an off day, or you get to drop the RPE point by 1. And I think how much you allow to change needs to be like, those are much harder questions to answer. And I think it is ultimately comes down to, where is the point where this is still something that the athlete can adhere to and overall enjoy, but it probably will require points where they're doing something they ultimately wouldn't do if they didn't have these goals, because they don't want to do it right now, but they need to. But we're flexing them to the point where we can get a slightly less discomfort out of it, but it's still kind of what we need to do based upon our best guess.
And you also hope that an athlete gains that autonomy to make those decisions and doesn't do what's just said on the paper. Mm-hmm. It's like, what's said on the paper is a plan, assuming everything is going right.
Yes.
And you want to arm the athlete with these tools to say, we're going to cut a set today. Or, you know what, we're going to stop there, probably the top set for today, right? Like you ultimately want to arm that athlete and educate them that they can make those decisions. Like you said, you have far more tools in the toolbox that you can use for bodybuilding, a little bit less for powerlifting, but there's still a good number. Mm-hmm. And I think those athletes is really important, because you ultimately want them. You want them while they're in the session to make those decisions. Consequently, when things are going well, you also want them to add load to the bar. You want them to push it, right? Like, that's the whole point. Like, whenever we talk about auto-regulation, everybody always uses the example of like, I'm having a hard day, I didn't sleep, take load off the bar. We very rarely talk about the other side. It's like, hey, it's RPE, you should add load, right? Like, that was clearly an AT7, you need an AT8, like, let's go.
You're adapting better than we expected. Yeah.
Exactly. So again, I think the ultimate goal is to educate an athlete the best you can so that they can make those decisions. And then the cool thing is, when that athlete becomes more self-aware, you can have better conversations to arm them in contest prep, like leading into a meet, so that they are able to make those decisions. Because they're going to face, like, I just had an athlete he's doing his first equip block. And I told him off the bat, I'm like, look, this is going to be really hard. You're not going to be used to this. This is a lot of skin discomfort. And you have to understand that here's what's on the paper. But if at any time, like, it gets this bad, you have to cut the session. Mm-hmm. You've got to stop there, move on to something else. Like, you need to know you have that leeway. And I think that's a hard thing to communicate as a coach to an athlete.
Yeah.
Well said.
As a kind of programming geek, I think that's the interesting part of programs. Like, looking at somebody's, well, I squat on Monday and then I do leg press. And like, I don't know, you've seen, if you've looked at this stuff for more than just a very tiny amount of time, you kind of get the idea of the range that's out there, and nothing much surprises you anymore. But the interesting part to me is how people modify these programs in light of unexpected things that pop up, and what kinds of unexpected things tend to pop up in different scenarios. You have the example of that I gave earlier of the G, where you do like really low doses of SBD work in the beginning of every session. It's a different experience, and it potentially leads to different issues versus the other kind of weekly structure where you may have much larger concentrations of a given training stimulus. And then, like you're saying, John, like, what kind of guardrails do you set up to mitigate those problems? I think that's where the real value of coaching and skilled program design is at anyway. There's not anything that you're going to write on the paper where I'm just going to be blown away. It's the details of how it's applied. And to a significant degree, like you're saying, John, that does come down to the training intelligence of the athlete in sentences abruptly. That's what I'm good at.
I agree.
Yeah, well, I think maybe...
It was a big exclamation mark.
Right, yeah,
There
maybe
you go.
that's the exclamation mark we needed, but I didn't realize it at the time because I've got to go lift some weights myself, actually.
Hey, that's a good
Yeah.
reason to stop.
Yeah, well, Eric, thanks for coming back, man, after 3 years of not taking my calls and ignoring my emails.
After being constantly invited and always turning it down, I've
Right.
decided to give you some time. Yeah.
Yeah, like maybe Eric must be like hitting some hard times or something. He's got to start doing the RTS podcast again.
I got to poach some clients for 3DMJs from
Right.
somewhere. But yeah,
No.
that's right.
It's always good to talk to you. Always enjoyable conversation. John, thanks for being here, man. Always enjoyed talking to you as well. Thanks everybody for watching and listening, and we'll see you next time.